Hello, I'm Alan Spencer, and today I'm talking to Jens Deeberg, a doctor and a world expert in value-based healthcare, and Stephen Oesterle, who after 40 years as a practicing doctor now works in private equity, looking at how money is invested in healthcare development. We want to look at value-based healthcare and the role that innovation can play in it. So my first question is to Jens, just to tell us very briefly, what is value-based healthcare?
Right, value-based healthcare is actually describing a way how we organize healthcare systems and how we organize care delivery within healthcare systems. So the idea of value-based healthcare is pretty simple. Value-based healthcare is rewarding providers who are achieving the highest value for patients and for the system. And value is actually measured by the outcomes that matter to the patients relative to the costs that we spend in order to achieve those outcomes. So why is this new? In the current healthcare system, you are typically rewarded for doing as many procedures as possible. The more procedures you do, the more money you get. This is not true in value-based healthcare. In value-based healthcare, we always start looking at the patient's medical condition, for example, a coronary artery disease, and then we ask ourselves, what is the most meaningful way in order to treat the patient, and what is the best way to achieve outcomes at the lowest possible costs? The ones who know how to do that get the most money. So this is a tectonic shift in healthcare, because what we have learned over the last 40 years in PCI is to very effectively treat patients with coronary artery disease using PCI and other techniques. What we are not so good at is to make meaningful decisions. What is, the best treatment option for a certain patient in order to achieve good long-term outcomes? And this will become, the new challenge in value-based healthcare systems.
Thank you, Jens. Stephen, all that sounds like it's got an awful lot to do with innovation. How does innovation fit in? How is it complementary to value-based healthcare?
Well, Al, I don't think there's any way that you can realize value-based healthcare without innovation. So let me restate value-based healthcare as I see it. Value essentially is the desired outcome by the patient, not necessarily the doctor, but the desired outcome by the patient, and in the denominator is the cost. So it turns out that innovation can actually increase the numerator and decrease the cost. How would you do that? Well, one is this, our whole move to less invasive therapies, which are all innovative therapies, starting with angioplasty 40 years ago. This essentially is a less invasive way to treat critical coronary disease. It's less expensive, less time in the hospital, and clearly desired by the patient. So there's an example of how innovation impacted value. You can look at this in many, many different ways. Take the transcatheter valve replacement. Again, historically, patients went into the hospital, they'd stay a week to 2 weeks, have a fairly morbid procedure. We can now do these procedures in 2 or 3 days, send the patient out. Patients are happier, they have a good outcome, and it's less cost. So there's another example of how innovation impacts value. To address Jens's last point about how do doctors really pick the right therapies, once again, I think innovation is going to play a role in helping us have better clinical judgment. We've reached a critical point in the world of innovation where computational speeds are incredibly fast and incredibly cheap, so that we can now begin to aggregate large databases, not just the work that's done in Milan or the work that's done in Paris or the work that's done in Boston, but to put very large data sets together and begin to learn from these data who actually benefits, how do we know what the right therapy is for a patient. This is software innovation, which I think is going to be a huge piece of this story of realizing value-based healthcare.
Very good. Software rather than hardware, Stephen, as
That's
you see
right.
it. Yeah, okay. Well, we're here at PCR celebrating 40 years of angioplasty. 40 years, long time. Where do we go next? Jens, how do you see that?
Well, there are a few very interesting dimensions. First of all, there are a lot of people on Earth who have not access to these kind of technologies. So it will be interesting to see whether we are able to, develop these technologies further in order to provide broader access to PCI stenting in emerging countries, for example. Another aspect is is a true future of healthcare, and particularly in the value-based healthcare world, just increasing the number of PCI stents? And I doubt that. So we see that we are reaching ceilings in many geographies, and we have to ask ourselves, how can we organize care over the whole care cycle of a patient in order to avoid coronary artery disease, in order to prevent acceleration of disease, and how can we provide patients with the relevant information at the relevant time that is trigger behavioral change. So my hope is in the long run that we are going to reduce PCI stenting where it is, at its top today, and we are going to move it into areas that will definitely benefit from it.
Right. And Stephen, your daily activity are medical innovations. Where do we go next with this?
Well, you've seen a lot of them, Alan highlighted here at this meeting in Paris here in May. There's a lot of really interesting work still being done on catheter-based valve therapy. These are large devices. Sort of working on how to scale these down and be able to deliver them transeptally, I think, is going to be an important development. We're seeing here for the first time, in my experience, a lot of attention towards tricuspid valve replacement, which no one had ever really thought much about. I think it's going to be huge. There's been a lot of controversy about bioerodible stents. I happen to believe that within a decade, somewhere between 50 to 80% of all stents will be polymer-based stents. And there's been a lot of disappointment about this because of the recent clinical trials with a certain commercially available bioerodible stent, but that's a first-generation stent. And what people, I think, don't realize is that there are 2 or 3 generations beyond that in the innovative pipeline that are going to solve many of the fundamental problems that have led to some disappointment in bioerodible stents. So, smaller valves, tricuspid position. The last big frontier after that is probably heart failure. And I can't tell you how that's going to be solved with catheters, but people are working on it.
Something you don't know, Stephen. That's amazing. Gentlemen, thank you very much for a peep into the future.
Thank you very much indeed.